let me maybe briefly introduce François and Irène. So François, I'm glad to have you. We made a few tries and finally it's nice to have you for this seminar. François is chargé de recherche, so it's a special status. It's something in between assistant and associate professor because it's a tenured position, except that you have low teaching load. Is that correct? Is that like the half load? Because supposedly you have a comparative advantage in research, so you dedicate most of your time to this. At PSC and INRA. INRA is the National Institute for Research in Agriculture and Agronomics. And Irène, you is a PhD student. Should be finishing, Irène. Is this your last year of PhD at PSC, or you have one more year to go?
Maybe one more year.
One more year. Okay. So we're very glad to have you. And very interesting topic, you know, how industrial fishing off the coast of Africa impact migration decisions, supposedly of people who live from fishing, but maybe I'm anticipating too much. So the floor is yours, Ed. You have 45 minutes for presentation, and we keep something like 15 minutes for discussion. People are welcome to interrupt you for clarification questions, either for panelists by opening their microphone or for the other participants by sending questions to the chat. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Hillel, for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm extremely happy to present in this seminar because I think that it's really one of the key seminars for this kind of work. And as you will see, there is not much about agriculture, but like INRA added an E at the end of INRA for environment. So I'm kind of safe with my employer. But we won't spend much time on that because it's basically an idea that I had very far in my mind for a bit of time. And then Irène came to my office while she was willing to do a master thesis. And then the whole project really started. Basically based on a few newspaper articles that were saying basically that Europe was taking African fish and was, of course, receiving fish, but also a lot of migrants because of that. So the first big newspaper article was an article in 2008 in the New York Times. But like even in recent years, you still have stuff in the New York Times and in other outlets. And they are mostly pointing nowadays at the fishing effort by the Chinese fleets, but basically the mechanism that they put forward is the same: more industrial fishing, less fish for the local population. Then basically what do? Then typically they have to find some way to live, and then some of them migrate themselves, or some of them basically use their boats, not to fish, not to catch fish, but to carry on migrant, for instance, to the Canary Islands. So that's a bit like the overall motivation. Of course, if we want to delve deeper in the scientific literature, we can find some related works. First of all, in the direction of fishing, of course. And a relatively recently published paper by Kroodsma and co-author is basically evaluated that industrial fishing affects more than half of the world's ocean area. It's about 4 times the area of land-based agriculture. And on top of it, like industrial fishing affects like a big share of the oceans, but it's also catching a lot of fish, like more or less 3/4 of the fish which is caught worldwide would be industrial. And it means that it puts marine resources under strong pressure. 87% of global fish stocks would be fully exploited or overexploited, and especially off African coastline. So typically, it's a paper which is trying to evaluate the extent of overfishing in some places and the extent of illegal fishing. And what is interesting for us, let's pick the right one. I'm there. Pick the Eastern Central Atlantic, which is the ocean, basically close to the West African coast. And like the blue circle indicates that the median fishery in the Eastern Central Atlantic is caught at a rate which is more than 2 times the maximum sustainable yield. So basically, the higher a dot, the higher the over-harvesting rate, okay? So if you're at 1, it means that you're just catching fish at the, like in the median fishery, you're catching fish at, sorry, it's the average fisheries, is not the median one. But basically, if you're at 1, it means it's a sustainable harvest, okay? If you're above, it's not. And the difference between basically the blue circle and the blue dot is basically the extent of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So you see that for the Eastern Central Atlantic, basically illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is very important and explains like a big chunk of fish over extraction. Okay, they compute this data using the same data that the one we are using. Okay, on fishing. So there is Eastern Central Atlantic. You see that southwest, I should have southeast Atlantic somewhere. Yeah, here, Southeast Atlantic is also a place where there's a lot of overfishing and so on. Okay, and Western Indian is also one of those places where there is quite a bit of overfishing. Okay, and of course, like it's a problem for fish, but it's a problem for a lot of people who are relying on fisheries. And typically, like you have very imprecise estimates, but Bellabib is estimating that there is around 1 million artisanal fishermen from Morocco to Namibia, which means that if you count their households and so on, you would have 6.7 million people who would be dependent on small-scale fisheries in 2010. The FAO has kind of other estimates for all Africa, estimating that you have 5 million fishermen and their households who depend on fisheries. So it's quite a bit of population. And of course, the problem is that fish, especially off African coast, is a common pool resource. Okay, and so artisanal fishing and industrial fishing are basically in competition, and they are in very strong competition, especially because there is very few regulation in those seas. Okay? You have a lot of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Okay, so what's our contribution? Basically, our first contribution is to link two very sensitive issues. We will link overfishing and migration, and we'll provide evidence about the link between both phenomena. And in a sense, we want to quantify one key element in the trade-off between the support to fishing fleets in OECD countries, for instance, and their migration policies. And basically, we suggest, or maybe even we show, that migration come as an adaptation strategy to increase industrial fishing and subsequent marine resource decline. The other contribution is maybe more methodological, or maybe more in terms of data, like at the limit between the two, because we combine very rich socioeconomic data with brand new data set on industrial fishing, and it's open potentially a promising research agenda because it brings basically a new way to have shocks on the table. Okay, so the outline of the talk is a bit peculiar. Of course, I will give a bit of literature, talk about the mechanisms, describe the data, but basically we have two big sections in our work. We have first a macro approach, where we will look basically at the inflows of asylum seekers in European countries of the OECD. Okay, so it's really like more a measure of the flows towards EU. And the micro approach is just taking the opposite side, and we're going to look at what happens on the coastal villages in Africa. We don't know where people go. We'll just try to see if there are more or less people on the coast. Okay, but we don't know where they go. Unfortunately, we cannot link basically the departure and the arrivals. And notice that at the very beginning of this project, I thought that the industrial fishing part would be the most difficult one, and that I could just jump to the 6th floor and ask Hillel about a good data set on migration. That Hillel told me, okay, everyone is using this data set, so use this one. Unfortunately, Hillel told me that it was much more tricky than that, and that data on migration are pretty difficult to get on a consistent basis, especially if we want to have yearly data and at subnational level and so on. So I'm looking forward to your comments on this side. What about the literature? What kind of literature do we have in mind? Of course, there is some literature on industrial fishing, saying that industrial fishing is kind of very important for the ocean and for the fish stocks. Okay. There is also a bit of literature on the effect of fishing and fishing conditions on the small fishermen adaptation strategies. For instance, you have papers saying that if there is pollution, then basically fishermen will catch less fish and will also eventually fish further. Okay, they will change of fishing grounds. That's the case for Vietnam in the paper of Huang. There are also a few papers that point at the relationship between fishing conditions and piracy. Basically, if there is no fish anymore or little fish, then fishermen are skilled when it comes to sea operation. And then one way to get an income when you're on the sea is also to use your boat and attack other boats. And so you have one paper on Indonesia, which is showing that bad fishing conditions induce piracy. And there is a paper by Flückinger and Ludwig, which is more like a panel of coastal country, and again, showing the same kind of link. And of course, you can adjust your, you can use your skill in a different way at sea, but you can also adjust your labor supply towards land-based activities. You can also reduce your food intake, as shown by Syahrul in Indonesia after episodes of coral bleaching. And basically, we want to contribute to this literature by saying, okay, but one of the potential land-based activity that we could have in mind is basically to migrate and try to find a job somewhere else. And so our paper is very closely related to the literature about environmental drivers of migration. Very often those papers are considering basically temperature fluctuations, water stress, basically topics related to climate change in a sense. Here we come with another basically environmental driver of migration on which maybe it's easier to have policy action, because when you look at the fleets which are catching fish in Africa, they are mostly coming from 2 or 3 European countries and a few countries in Asia. We also kind of contribute to the literature on commons, but I won't spend too much time on that since it's probably a bit further from the core interest of seminar participants. But of course, I can expand on that. It's closer to my own literature. Now, what do we have in mind in terms of mechanisms? Basically, what we think is that conditionally on fishing conditions, you may have more fishing. More precisely, if fishing conditions are good, you expect the industrial fishing to induce higher income. You expect also to have more income for artisanal fishermen, like for small-scale fishermen. Okay, so basically, we want to control for the fishing conditions. And what we have in mind is that when industrial fishing occurs, it catches fish and it will reduce the artisanal fishermen income. And this negative shock on their income might induce migration. We would very much like to estimate, like basically the green dashed arrows, but it's something we cannot do because we don't have very good and extensive data on artisanal fishermen. I should contact some people in Kiel to have better data on that, and probably on smaller samples, but so that's on the to-do list. But in this paper, what we're going to do is basically to evaluate the reduced form linking industrial fishing and out migration. Okay, and of course we will control for fishing conditions because they matter for both the small-scale fishermen income and the income or the activity actually of industrial fishing. Okay. The key explanatory variable that we have is of course industrial fishing. And industrial fishing came from this work of Kroodsma and co-author based on 22 billion positions recorded globally from the automatic identification system of boats. So it's basically a kind of GPS device which is on board of many boats to avoid basically collision between boats. Okay. And the different co-authors have trained 2 convolutional neural networks to track 70,000 fishing vessels and classify them in 6 categories according to the type of fishing vessels, the type of fishing they are pursuing, like whether it is a trawler, for instance, or whether it is a boat catching tuna using a pursue seine, for instance. Okay. Then they infer the moment where those boats are catching fish versus the moment where they are just going from one point to another. And they distribute the data at a grid cell resolution of about 1 kilometer. And so it means that for each square kilometer on the oceans, we have the number of fishing hours. Okay. And actually we use the data that were published and the provisional data for 2017 and 2018. So how does it look like? Basically, you can go on the website, you are all in front of your computer and your screen. So I should not like deflect you towards internet, but still, if you go on the website, you can just go for a given day, you go somewhere in the ocean, and basically you will see the blue dots, which are dots where there is a fishing effort, and you can click on them. And here you have Villa de Marin, which is kind of a Spanish boat, which was catching fish, basically starting from Dakar and catching fish in Senegalese water. And you see that here there is more fishing effort in the southern part of the Senegalese fishing grounds. Some boats like do other stuff. It's also a Spanish boat, like also going out from Dakar, and you see that they go in the international waters, but like also in Cape Verde, and a tiny bit here they start to catch fish a bit far from the African coast, but still in the exclusive economic zone of it could be Gambia. To be confirmed. Okay, so that's the main X variable that we use. Of course, then we want to have a Y variable.
Sorry,
yes,
François? Sorry.
Yes.
I've been told to unmute and ask directly, so sorry to interrupt. It's just, I had a question. It was both about the framing and about the identification, but I think the framing might be more interesting, where you were presenting the literature review. Since your project is very original and I think very super interesting and innovative, I was thinking of what other types of similar, mechanisms that we see in the literature. One thing I was thinking of would be the mechanization of agriculture, right? So technological progress releasing labor. So it might be interesting to frame it in that sense, because I think then it would be also interesting to think of the differences. And so I was thinking of, soy in Brazil versus Spanish boats coming. And of course, one of the differences is this interaction with international players coming in, right? Which means that, at least in the case of soy, so I mean, there's a redistribution question, but it's Brazil. Whereas here, what's interesting is that coming from outside. So that was my framing remark, or I don't know how you're thinking about it. But then there's also an identification or the question of how you're thinking about this shock of this shock coming from outside. Are you purely thinking about it as like technology coming from outside, being imported by foreign players? And how are you thinking potentially also of the politics of letting those players in? And then there might be a lot of different issues and potentially interesting, some of them having consequences on your identification strategy.
Yeah, so first of all, like I fully agree with your point about mechanization. It's really like capital intensive versus labor intensive technology, and like I think it has been studied like in the case of agriculture, and I fully agree that it is extremely relevant in this case. Of course, as you say, that the redistributional consequences are a bit different because. If it's within a country, it's slightly easier to control. Here, like you have a lot of African countries, basically they are just unable to control their water. Like in Liberia, they have one boat. Like the Liberian Coast Guard, they have one boat. So basically they are just unable to monitor the whole exclusive economic zone, which means that basically a lot of the profits are exported. So, and even when you have fishing agreements, we'll just try to come back, and because up. So, and you do have quite a few fishing agreements between the European Union and African countries, but like should be below. But basically, you see that the European Union signed a fishing agreement with Senegal between 2014 and 2020 for basically 38 boats. Okay, and the compensation that you don't see actually up. But the compensation was 1.8 million per year, which means that basically you can frame it differently, saying that the European Union is paying 50,000 euro per boat, which is going and catching fish in Senegal, and basically they catch more than 1,000 tons of tuna, for instance. So it's clearly like you see that most of the benefits are exported out of Senegal. And on top of that, nothing guarantees that the money flowing to Senegal is indeed flowing to the people who were catching fish before. So that's, you need very strong assumptions for this mechanization to have a positive impact on the local economy.
Great, thanks.
So let's now go from the industrial fishing data towards the migration data, and first at the macro level. So at the macro level, we'll pick a panel of 37 African countries, basically those who have access to the sea. And we'll aggregate the number of fishing hours like in the territorial sea. So basically in the first 12 nautical miles, you're not supposed to have any foreign boats and nor any big boats. It's supposed to be like water for small-scale fishermen. 24 nautical miles, it's a bit like the fuzzy area. We use 68 kilometers because according to Carlos Kind, it's basically the average distance or the average length of the continental shelf. And it's basically there that you have most of the fish. And then we also use as a robustness check, the exclusive economic zone. So that's basically the variation of fishing effort between years. There is some. Otherwise, we could not use it basically in a panel regression. And we'll merge that with data on migration. And what we're going to use are the inflows of asylum seekers into OECD countries and Russia by country of origin. And we'll restrict the analysis at some point to the inflows to the European OECD countries. Okay. So we start with a sample of more than 4,000 applications. Of course, those are aggregated numbers. And so our Y variable will be the number of people flowing to OECD countries or flowing, let's go straight to the European countries of the OECD. So it's the number of asylum seekers application from the different African countries by year. Okay. And then we'll control for chlorophyll content, sea surface temperature, and basically fishing conditions. But I'm not going to spend too much time on that. We'll also control for weather variables, vegetation data. We'll control for GDP and for like conflict / political transitions. So what's basically the estimation strategy that we have in mind is the number of asylum seekers by country of origin per year as a function of the total fishing effort in the given African country in the year before over basically space Z, very often like 24 nautical miles or 68 kilometers, controlling for fishing conditions and eventually political transitions, GDP and so on. We put country fixed effect, year fixed effect, and we weight the regressions by the country's coastal population in 2000. So what's the idea? The idea is, of course, that we don't expect a lot of people to be affected by industrial fishing in Democratic Republic of Congo, okay, because the coastline is super small. So basically, we don't want to give DRC too much weight, okay? So we weight by the coastal population in 2000 so that we have a data point which is predetermined to our window of analysis. And so what do we get? We get basically that when you have more industrial fishing, it seems that there are more asylum seekers in OECD countries. Okay, so it's there as a simple correlation. like with country and year fixed effect. Then we control for environmental variables, fishing conditions, precipitation, temperature, wet days, and so on. Very stable estimate. Then we control for GDP. Of course, you may say that GDP is endogenous because fish also contributes to the GDP, but anyway, like we don't have a big change in the point estimates. And last but not least, we do control for political transition. So it's a dummy variable saying whether there is an improvement in the political conditions or a degradation. Log fatalities is the number of people killed in conflict events, and affected is whether there were people affected by natural disasters. Okay, and again, we don't, actually the coefficient, the point estimate gets even larger. That's true if we take 24 nautical miles, and we have very similar point estimates if we take 68 kilometers. So how do we interpret that? Basically, if you have a 1% increase in industrial fishing within a country like 68 kilometers during a given year, then we expect an increase of asylum applications by 0.05% from this country and this year. So if we try to have a sense of what happens like on average, it means that at the average, if you have a 1 standard deviation in the log of fishing hours, so it basically means at the average it's an increase by 524 hours or 22 days. So it means a boat would spend 22 days like fishing continuously, then you should expect 1,300 additional asylum seekers. Then we can repeat the analysis, but focus just on men. Basically, we get very similar results. Okay, so it seems that the effect is very much driven by males. Okay. Then what is interesting is that we can basically draw a graph of the residuals to see which countries in Africa are driving up the results and which one are driving the results down. Okay, and typically, so the size of the bubble is basically corresponds to the coastal population of a given country. So its weight in the regression. The color of the bubble corresponds to the region in which the country is. And you should read this graph by considering that the dots which are above the zero line on the right side are kind of playing like are the one pushing the relation up, like increasing the point estimates. Okay, while the dots which are below are killing the result. Okay, so typically the countries which are killing the results are basically the countries like in South Africa, in North Africa, and eventually in East Africa. And the countries which are driving the results are mostly basically the West African countries and the Central African countries. Well, Central Africa, you could say that there are dots below and above, but the general sense is that really the group of countries which is really driving the result or mostly driving the results are West African countries. Here you have the name of the countries, but in the interest of time, I should speed up. So, of course, like it's not a bulletproof strategy. And how can we strengthen the strategy? First, by including more controls. And typically more controls about land-based economic opportunities. The problem of adding controls is that because we work at the African country level, sometimes it's hard to get the data. Each time we include a new control, like typically on political transitions and so on, it's very hard to have consistent data for the 37 countries. And so very quickly we tend to lose countries. Another thing we do is, and we can play on lags and leads to support our findings. And basically, if we pick the fishing effort of next year, basically does not explain asylum applications at all, okay? So what matters for asylum applications is basically the fishing effort of this year and the year before. We could also try to have an instrument, like the price of fish in Europe and China, for instance, interacted with past fishing agreements or fish potential productivity, but we're not super specialized in fisheries, so it's not the way we took. What we've preferred to do is to delve deeper into the mechanisms by working within country and at the household level. Okay, and it's why we have a micro approach. And so in this micro approach, we'll try to stick as much as possible with the macro approach But of course, because the data are different, like we are consistent with the macro approach, but you will see that there are small differences. So what do we use there? We use basically all DHS that we could leverage between 2012 and 2018. What does it mean? It means that the very nice feature with the DHS is that they are extremely standardized across countries and across time. They are geocoded, so we know where the clusters are. Of course, it's a bit weak in the sense that we don't have a panel component and we have very, very little information about income generating activities. Given our purpose, we'll work with 13 countries, 27 survey wave, and more than 300,000 coastal, you will see how we define it, rural households. Okay, and we'll focus on household size. So that's the map of the different countries we have in the sample. Quite a bit of them are actually in West Africa, but not only there. That's the number of observations per country. I can come back on that, but like typically what is important is what's our strategy? What's the idea? The idea that we have is that we have several villages, A, B, C. The villages are not exactly on the coastline, but so we'll pick basically the point on the coastline, which is the closest to each village. We'll measure this distance. And basically on this hub or on this access to the sea, we'll draw a circle of 68 kilometers. And we'll basically compute some relevant explanatory variable. Industrial fishing, fishing conditions, like typically. Of course, we would love to measure artisanal fishing, but that's something we can't hope for. But still, what's the idea? The idea is that if you have more industrial fishing, controlling for fishing condition, then basically we expect to have more out migration. And so we expect household size to decrease. Of course, we know that some households will just also leave the area if there is out migration, but especially because young males are quite active in fishing, and because young males are usually the most mobile, we don't expect the whole household to move immediately. And so we expect that for some household, there will be less people on board, and so the household size will go down. Okay. And we expect the household size to decrease more. The closer is the village to the coastline and the more industrial fishing there is. Okay, so the specification gives you the household size as a function of industrial fishing at the sea access for this household or for this cluster. We control for the distance to the coastline, and then we interact fishing condition and distance to the coastline. So in a sense, we don't expect this effect to be very large the further is the household from the sea. Okay. We will restrict the analysis, first of all, for the households which are at most at 200 kilometers from the coastline. Okay. So, of course, for some countries, it means it's a lot of households. For some countries, you have a lot of people who are living far from the coastline. Okay. And so what do we get as a relationship? We have that like fishing effort last year decreases household size this year. Okay. So if fishing effort last year increases by 1%, you expect household size to decrease by 0.06. And if you control for fishing conditions, actually you tend to increase this coefficient by a lot. Okay. And we have this result for 24 nautical miles and the same for 68 nautical miles. So it's controlling for fishing condition. In the last regression, we do have a country year fixed effect and control for weather. Okay, on top of that. We can basically run this regression by putting a lot of interactions and like isolating specific coefficients for each country. When I say that you can do that, it means that we do it for industrial fishing here. We do it also for the interaction between industrial fishing and distance to coast. So I should spend a bit of time on that. So here, like, what's the intuition if we take column 3? It means that if you have a village which is exactly at the coastline, or almost exactly like at 1 kilometer from the coastline, basically you expect industrial fishing to reduce here like 1% more industrial fishing would reduce household size by 0.2. Sorry, it's a semi-elasticity. It's not a full elasticity, okay, by 0.2. But the further you go from the coastline, basically, the less negative or the more positive becomes this effect, okay, which is somehow what we expected. It means that if you go sufficiently far from the coastline, basically here at log 5 or 6, if you go at a distance of log 6 from the coastline, then basically you get a zero effect of industrial fishing on household size. And so we can compute after that the average marginal effect for each country. And you see that the country for which the average marginal effect is the largest is basically Senegal. Okay, then Togo, Tanzania have average marginal effect, which are negative, which means that for them, on average, industrial fishing tend to decrease household size. Okay, same for Kenya, and then you have some countries for which the average marginal effect ends up being positive, like BG's Benin, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Okay. And for the other countries, it's not that you find much. Actually, Nigeria is also a significant and negative average marginal effect. Okay. What we can also do is to use the villages which are very far from the coastline as a counterfactual, leaving a buffer between the green dots, like which are closer to 200 kilometers from the to the coastline, and the red dots, which are further than 300 kilometers. And if we do so, basically, the effect just vanish. Okay, if we run the same kind of regression on households which are further than 300 kilometers, you see that there is nothing. Okay, nothing significant in terms of log industrial fishing hours. Same for the interaction. You may have eventually something here that we have to investigate when we take 68 kilometers and we put all the controls. What we can also do is to repeat this kind of lags versus leads exercise and pick basically the fishing effort of next year. Okay, so that's the first three columns are just reporting the results that you already saw before that. And then we run exactly the same regressions, but we pick like fishing effort in the year after the survey. And here we don't find much. Actually, we don't find anything for fishing effort. There is something for the interaction, but which is very small, which is again something we have to understand at this stage, but like the placebo seems to work decently, at least for forward log fishing hours. So if we have to summarize, basically a 1% increase in the past industrial fishing hours near a village ends up basically sending away 1% for 1,000 households. And this effect fades out at around 150 kilometers. Okay. So we have to think about what could threaten the internal validity of the result that we have. And one potential threat is the reverse causality, of course. We don't believe too much into that, because what would be the story? The story would be that industrial fleets could catch fish in areas which are neglected by small-scale fishermen, and the small-scale fishermen would have been absent due to past migration or selective mortality in the past. And it's not very plausible, given what is reported. It's not that those industrial boats are really taking into account what the small fishermen were doing like 20 years ago and so on, and they don't take into account the migration flows. On top of that, this kind of story should be true within country and even within region, because we have robustness checks which are kind of which are putting like regional fixed effects. Okay. So it's a bit hard to believe. We don't think that reverse causality is the main threat. The main threat is coming from omitted variable bias. What kind of omitted variable bias do we have in mind? We could have in mind the fishing agreements. The fishing agreements could bring more boats on the sea and at the same time increase job opportunities. Like typically, for instance, because the European Union is sending money to Senegal to create jobs in some sectors. So if the job opportunities are open in the coastal rural areas, then they would reduce out-migration from the coastal rural areas. And if it's really well done, they would reduce out-migration from the places where you had a lot of small-scale fishermen. If on the other side, the job opportunities are created in urban areas, then they could act as a pull factor for internal migration, overstating our estimates. So then we have to think of whether we think that fishing agreements are really creating a lot of employment opportunities. And if we think that the payment from the European Union to Senegal is a payment of 2 million per year, actually less than 2 million per year, you don't expect like a huge multiplier effect related to this kind of level of payment. And on top of that, nothing guarantees that 100% of the sum is kind of really reaching like the population. The other type of omitted variable bias that worries us is meteorological factors. Like typically what determines the abundance of phytoplankton may also influence migration. So rain could increase phytoplankton and agricultural yields at the same time, which means that it would increase the number of boats and the income generated on the sea and the income generated from like land-based activities. In this case, that would downward bias our estimates. We would have more boats on the sea and more people staying because they have some job in the agriculture. So that's not really the kind of threat we have in mind. What we have in mind are actually shocks which are negatively correlated between the sea and land. So that's really the main threat to our strategy. So think about heavy winds and storms. They could worsen fishing conditions, but improve agricultural yields, which means that you would not observe industrial boats at sea. But on the other side, the farmers would be super happy and would not migrate, would not out-migrate. In which case, that would upward bias our estimates. Okay, and so we are currently bringing new controls to make sure that we don't have this kind of threat to the internal validity of our approach. Okay, at this stage, we do put like region year fixed effect and not just country year fixed effect. And basically our results are kind of still there and quite stable when we put the region year fixed effect. So what's basically the main contribution we have? We provide empirical evidence that industrial fishing increases the number of asylum seekers. It's basically a push factor in terms of migration along the coastal areas. And that's something we can identify over 30 countries, but which seems more important for some countries than others, like Senegal, for instance. Notice that we are not claiming that these migrants are the same. You may have like a kind of domino effect where some people migrate from coastal areas, like rural areas, they go to urban areas, then people who are already in the urban areas are the one migrating. So we cannot track like migration, but still there is a link according to us. And we think that this link has huge policy implications. First of all, for countries exposed to foreign industrial fishing, it's an additional element basically to defend their national fishing areas, saying, okay, if you catch all our fish, okay, fine, but some people won't have a job, won't have employment, and so you might get more migration. So it can call for a stricter regulation. And for countries which are conducting industrial fishing and dealing with migration inflows, then basically it's also a way to kind of make a link between different like policies which are in the hands of the European Union, but maybe not in the same like departments, like typically the DG Mare and Frontex, for instance. So yeah, I guess that's the conclusion, and I'm happy to rest a tiny bit and leave you some space for questions. And
okay, François, thank you. I know from the chat and from Simone that there are many questions. And since we're a bit short of time, I suggest we take all the questions before you answer. Okay, so this way you can also pick the questions you like most, but or for which you have stronger elements. I will just make two comments, let's say, but don't answer them, and then we will take the row of questions. I saw in the chat, for example, that Jean-François Meistat asked, why do you look at refugees rather than migrants? Here, I think it's also in terms of framing a bit, I would say, this great attention, because you're implicitly saying, refugees are really economic migrants, the way you think about them. They are bad, there is competition from industrial fishing, and they will portray themselves as political refugees and claim asylum. So here you have to really, I think, justify very well why you look at refugees in this context. And relatedly, you say you're controlling for conflicts. And I was wondering whether you are not over-controlling. Maybe conflict is one of the channels of, whether it's about control, essentially. Did you consider that? Do you have an increase in your point estimate when you don't control for conflict and so on? And the last point I wanted to make, I'm not sure I fully understood, when you said there are some countries pushing the relationship up, some countries pushing the relationship down. I was wondering whether this whole debate, incentive versus constraints in migration, when you have more poverty, do you have more migration or less migration? Can you analyze your results or contribute to this very long debate about the handshake migration function, migration relationship with income? All right, so these were the things I noted. Maybe a very last thing, the policy implications. The refugees or the people who migrate do not necessarily go to the countries who send the boats to the coast. So there is if it's the EU as a whole, then you may say something, but I don't think individual countries would internalize, I would say, this externality. Okay, and there are questions from Timothée, from Sekou, from Marion maybe, and Simone, I suggest you do the allocation of questions because you have track of all the people who wanted to ask questions.
Yeah. Then the first team, Sekou, Marion, just go on.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the very interesting presentation. So my two questions have already been asked by Hillel. He read them, but I take the opportunity to ask another one. And so it's still related to the type of migration you are looking at. And I think urbanization should also be an important channel if you think about income. So maybe you would have better chance to obtain good data on that. So if you have this income effect in mind, I would expect a strong rural to urban migration. So if you have a chance to look at that, would be great. Thanks.
Marion?
Yes, thank you very much for this very nice presentation. I had just a short question about what you measure with the left-hand side variable in the micro part of the paper. And I was wondering whether it could be the case that there is also something happening in terms of fertility behaviors, if this is a purely income effect that you are capturing with industrial fishing.
Yeah, let me then follow up on this. I think that the more general concern that we might have is that you are considering that household composition is exogenous. So you have out-migration and this reduces household size, while you might have additional changes going on with possibly two different households that merge. And so you don't see an effect on average household size. So I think that this should be justified a bit more. Clément, do you want to jump in on your question?
No, it was more a comment, I think, on both cases. So I'm happy to leave the floor to others.
Okay.
I've written them, I guess, in the chat.
Yeah. I'm gonna send these to François and Irène. François, do you want to have a go at these first batch of questions and comments?
Yeah, I can try to answer in a short period of time to as many questions as I can. So Simone and Marion, yeah, I fully agree that what we would like to have ideally is the number of people living in a given village, and basically the demographic structure, age of everyone, and so on. on the age structure, we can play on that using the household composition. If some households are just leaving, if some households are merging, and so on. Unfortunately, there is no information in the DHS surveys about the number of households that they have in a given cluster. So the solution would be to switch to LSMS data, where we could look also at income and so on. But the problem of LSMS data is that the samples are much smaller, and then we don't get so many people along the coastline. So it's a bit underpowered in this direction. For the type of migration, Sekou, thanks a lot for suggesting to look at urbanization. That's something we can do on a consistent basis using land use data. So I guess that's one way to look at it. We started to work on asylum applications, basically by consistency with Missira and Schlenker, who had this paper on temperature shock and asylum applications. We've looked at economic migrants, but actually the composition of migrants is very different. Like in economic migrants, there are a lot of women, for instance. Like it seems like, I don't know enough about that, but it seems that the very the unplanned migration, in a sense, is more like in the asylum applications. And the other part which was surprising to us is that actually there are a lot of asylum applications from people coming from countries where you would not expect a lot of asylum applications. Of course, there are a lot of them from Eritrea, but there are also a lot of them from Senegal, Benin, and so on. And it brings us to the question about like the political economy between European countries. Where indeed, like if you take the European Union and the single decider, that's something, but like most of the boats catching fish in Africa are basically coming from France and from Spain. There are also like Russian boats, like Korean and Chinese boats, but like in EU, it's mostly France and Spain. They do receive a lot of migrants, by the way. Spain has a lot of people going to Canary Islands, and a lot of West African migrants do go to France. So maybe they don't internalize fully, but maybe they don't internalize because they don't realize that there is a problem, or they don't want to see. So hopefully if we can contribute in this direction. And I do agree about the bad control, so it's why we bring them at the very end. And again, political transition is also a bad control, because if you have a lot of boats coming from outside and people have a low income, then of course maybe you have a political transition. So we all bring them in the third instance.
Okay. Thank you. Simone, do we have more questions?
Not in the chat, so I can simply ask whether other panelists or attendees want to ask questions. Okay, then it's...
I can ask one last question if there's time.
Go on, Yvonne.
So in the very beginning, you mentioned that some of these fishermen, maybe from Senegal, they could also act as smugglers because they have a boat. So you mentioned that in the motivation, and I was just wondering throughout your presentation if there's any way to disentangle that, or if you have any evidence on this, because I think it would lead to different policy implications, whether these fishermen become unemployed and then asylum seekers, or whether they become smugglers because it's more profitable.
We have no way to test for that as of now, and I'm not sure it's easy to do. We haven't seen literature in economics about that, but there is some literature, like more in sociology and anthropology, of some people who did spend a lot of time in Senegal and discuss with the fishermen and basically relating that actually they take the risk of carrying migrants to Mauritania or to Canary Islands, basically to speed up like the movements. So nothing in economics, a tiny bit in more ethnographic or anthropological literature.
Thanks.
Okay, so thanks to Yvonne, we are right on time. And so thank you very much, François and Irène. I think it's very important question and a fascinating way to approach it. I forgot in my introduction to mention you're known at PSC as the geolocalized data guy. And this was a good illustration of this, and looking forward to exchanging with you on this and beyond. So goodbye, everybody. And Simone, do you want to announce next week's seminar?
No, it's just a nice transition. The last question is from the presenter next week. So Yvonne is gonna present a paper in 1 week from now, and I hope to see you online next Wednesday. Have a nice afternoon.
Okay, goodbye everybody.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.